So the Chosen roundtables have been really great so far. We're not going to look at every single little piece of them, so if you do want to see them, go to the Chosen app and watch them there. However, there are some really interesting parts that I want to talk about here on the channel, and that includes this whole situation with Jesus and Peter, the renaming of Simon to Peter at Caesarea Philippi, and what is happening here during this whole scene. It's really, really interesting. Obviously, I've given my take on my channel, but let's talk about it here as well and jump in with the experts and listen to hear what they have to say about this whole situation.
So he gets there and he starts going into the whole, who do people say that I am? It's directly from scripture. And then Simon makes this declaration of, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Notice this whole time, I haven't watched this whole thing, by the way. I just watched the first few minutes to get it in the right spot here. Notice that Dallas doesn't look over at the Catholic priest quite yet. He's kind of only looking at Doug Hoffman and trying to get his take on it and see what's going on. It's a very interesting, you don't often see kind of this shy version of Dallas here, which is quite interesting.
And then Jesus refers to him as Petros, right? Which literally means little rock, because Petra is big rock, correct? I mean, let's
that's part of the debates.
Yeah.
He is correct. Petros versus Petra. Petros is small rock. It's like a pebble, like a river rock. And then Petra is a big rock, like a cliffside or a mountain, large rock.
Yes.
That's part of the debate. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the little nod that Jesus gives to Matthew in this episode to start taking notes, because this scene is based on Matthew 16. Right. So that was a great little tidbit that you portrayed in the show. But indeed, as Matthew's taking those notes, writing in Greek, and the Greek word for rock is Petros. Petra, that's the feminine ending for when you're talking about a rock, but you're not going to give a man a feminine name, so it's got the masculine spelling, Petros. And really it's that pun that's important. Jesus says, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. And so the debate has been for many evangelicals and Catholics, is the church built on Peter, or is it built on what Peter said?
Yeah, and this is what the debate comes down to, right? Clearly, you guys know me. In the comment section, please don't fight about this, right? There's no reason to fight. This has been going on for, well over, a long amount of time, right? Well over all of our lifetimes. And so we're not going to solve it in the comments below by yelling at each other. If you're Catholic, I respect your view. I just don't agree, right? I'm coming from an evangelical Protestant point of view, and so I've made a whole video talking about this. I do not believe that Jesus was talking about building his church on Peter. However, let's talk about both sides here and break it down a little bit more.
Is it based on the man, or is it based on the man's testimony? Yeah. And that's been, I think, the heart of the debate.
Well, or to what degree? To what degree is it on his testimony, and to what degree is it on the man?
Well, and there's also the perspective of the rock being the 12, the disciples. That it's I'm going to call you Petros, and on this Petra I'm going to build my church. And so that's why, in my perspective and in the way that's portrayed, he's looking at Peter when he says, I'm going to name you Peter, rock, and then he steps back, and on this rock I'm going to build my church. I'll admit, we were doing a little bit of dancing here, because this was a tough one.
This is a very common thing for Dallas as well. For example, when it comes to Jesus' brothers and sisters, this is another big argument between Catholics and Protestants in particular. Dallas, being a Protestant himself, right? Obviously, he believes that Jesus had brothers and sisters. We've had conversations about this. He's talked about this on live streams. He's talked about it elsewhere, right? In his mind, Jesus definitely had brothers and sisters. That's why he mentions them in The Chosen Season 3, but he doesn't necessarily clarify that it's his brothers. In Dallas's mind, it's his brothers, but in the actual script, it's debated. Why? Because he wants to leave it open for interpretation so that we can kind of play nice within this. So I get why he does that, though I probably wouldn't make the same decision.
I'm trying to not be unnecessarily controversial, but I do have a perspective. I do have a theological perspective on it. So let's just go around the table and give at least the backdrop of what the discussion has been. So from the Catholic perspective, that's a very important and popular passage of Scripture, and at least the majority of Catholics that I've spoken to or heard from or who comment on social media, this is the
Catholics commenting on social media? No, Protestants and Catholics don't comment on social media. What are you talking about?
Peter. Like, talk about Peter as the first pope. Where does this come from?
Well, first of all, there's a recognition in this that Jesus recognizes there's going to need to be leadership, and that's already come clear from the fact that he chooses the 12, and that he really focuses on the 12 that are being prepared to be leaders for other people. And in this incident, not only does he name Peter, and from the Catholic perspective, not only does he name Peter with this title as the Rock, but we would see it as the establishment of the Petrine ministry, of the leadership ministry that would continue in the church, and then
which becomes connected to the Pope and all that kind of stuff.
Peter's role in establishing the church through Scripture, and then ultimately through his crucifixion in Rome, established Peter as having this office, and then that there were people that followed him. That somebody followed immediately into that office, and that.
Yep. So he's talking about the papacy here. He's talking about the office of the Pope comes from directly Peter. Peter was the first Pope, and then there's another person directly after him, and then directly after him, then directly after him, then directly after him, into the Pope that we have today.
That Petrine office that was established here continues clear through today to Pope Francis. That would be the Catholic perspective. Right. Although recognizing that he's part of leadership, and also I think there's a recognition. I love the way that the apostles ask, why him? Because he's not the most understanding, he's not the most faithful, he's not the most even-tempered, and it's also meant to be sort of a source of humility to say that when God calls, God has something in mind that we might not understand when it happens.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I just disagree that there is somehow this, and again, I'm going to argue with a lot of Catholics throughout the next few seasons about a lot of different things. I'm sorry about that. I love you guys. You know that I love you. I have a lot of Catholic people in my community. It's just what I believe. It's how I believe, okay? And so I'm going to argue with a lot of different things, including, we're going to talk about a lot of things in season 5, a lot of things in season 6. These institutions, I think, that the Catholic traditions hold up. For example, the papacy, for example, what the Eucharist brings with bishops and things like that. I just don't align with a lot of that stuff. And so for me, we're definitely going to have a lot more conversations like this. So please don't hate me. I know you guys are going to disagree. It's okay that we disagree here.
Yeah, we, my wife Amanda, who with you writes the Bible studies and has done some of our devotional books, and I've contributed to that as well. She talks about Peter being called a rock, and one of the reasons for that, and we get into this in later in episode 2, is I make people what they aren't. Mm-hmm. And Matthew says he doesn't, far be it from me to question you, Jesus, but he doesn't act like a rock. But what is there doesn't seem to be much debate that Peter was a leader, if not the leader of the 12.
100%. Yeah. Peter was clearly one of the most influential. Even when we see Paul later on, he talks about Peter quite often, right? Even to the point where he argues with Peter about certain things, and Peter is in the wrong about certain things later on in the New Testament. And so there are a lot of things that Peter definitely is the leader of the group in general. He has a lot of leadership qualities. He's clearly part of the inner circle of Christ. He is clearly a major, massive part of the early church. I don't deny that at all, for sure.
That's church tradition. Is that Jewish tradition as well?
Yeah, of course. I think I think it's both and. I think obviously there is this founding confession of what Peter states. I actually think, I wrote about in one of our books, The Rock, Dodo, and the Rabbi, that his confession is kind of like the New Testament Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the foundational principle of the declaration of who God is. And
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I like that a lot. The Shema obviously is this, it's this saying that the Jewish people would have on their hearts at all time, right? And so Peter's declaration here that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, he is God, he is the Messiah, right? That declaration should be on our hearts at all times to understand who Christ is. Hey, if you're liking this video and you want to support what we do here on The Chosen Sleuth, it would really help us out if you would join our Patreon at snipesupport.com. Even just $5 a month really adds up if everybody joins in and helps us to make more and more videos just like this. This helps us with travel, for example, Chosen Con or different things like that. It helps us to do more and more with the cast of The Chosen or the Chosen crew, and it allows us to be able to continue to make videos like this without me wasting time on something else in order to pay our bills and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to see more videos, bigger videos, better videos from us here on The Chosen Sleuth, then check out snipesupport.com, and we could really use your help. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
an allegiance to God. So Peter's confession is kind of like the New Testament version of this foundational declaration, this kind of creedal understanding becomes the soil in which so much of our belief about who Jesus, Yeshua is, comes out of. But I think there's also something unique about Peter that we can't overlook as well.
Sure.
And that's this, right? And he says, and he talks about being given the keys of the kingdom.
Right.
Whatever you bind on heaven will be bound. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed. This is an important one I want to talk about as well. Yeah. But one thing, it's when you look at the greater context of the New Testament, right, especially when you look at it from the context of following up in the book of Acts. Well, think about it for a moment. Peter is the one, in a sense, who has the key that opens up salvation to the Jewish people, right? He's the one who stands up, Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost, proclaims the gospel. Thousands of Jewish people believe on that day. So the birth of the Jewish ecclesia, the Jewish believing community, is birthed out of Peter's ministry in a very unique way. But he's also the one who is the first to bring the gospel to the centurion.
Yep, this is at Caesarea Maritima, where he brings the gospel to Cornelius, and they begin to speak in tongues. It's basically the Gentile Pentecost.
Right, in Caesarea. And, you know, and for the first time, the Gentiles are officially welcome in and believe as well. So he opens up the door to the Jews to believe. He opens up the door to the Gentiles to believe. And there's something in, you know, because God is in the details. He calls him Simon, son of Jonah. Only 2 places in the New Testament is he called Simon, son of Jonah, here and in John 21. Well, why is it important that he's called son of Jonah? Jonah is the one who opens up salvation to the Gentiles. He's the only prophet in the Hebrew scripture that we read about going to a Gentile nation, preaching a message of salvation, and a nation repents and believes. And this is, again, Peter is the New Testament Jonah.
Rabbi Jason Sobel does this quite a bit. I'm not sure if I 100% agree when he does stuff like this. Simon, son of Jonah, clearly is talking about his father, Jonah. It's not talking about the prophet Jonah. So it's hard to say that this is actually connected, right? There's no biblical prophecy, for example, that connects Peter to Jonah, right? I understand what he's saying, and there definitely could be a connection there, but Jason Sobel does this quite a bit, where he will take sort of some loosely connected things and put them together with cement. So I don't always agree when he does stuff like this. I would just be a little bit more careful when I hear him do stuff like this.
Opening up salvation not just to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And there's something that's significant about that.
And like Jonah, a reluctant prophet, right? We see Peter's imperfections as well. I think there's something of a false choice that has been pressed upon people in this. You know, does Peter mean little pebble over against large rock? I mean, clearly,
Doug is like, he is trying his best to keep the peace here, man, to play the middleman. I understand what he's about to say here. Let's listen to it, and then I'll give my my thoughts on it.
you know, you are the Christ, the Son of God, is this declaration of Jesus' identity that is a foundational belief of the church. And Peter's the one that makes that statement, perhaps on behalf of all of the apostles. I don't think we need to choose between, is it the statement or is it the person?
But the problem here, I'll let him finish, and then I've got some stuff to say here.
Jesus is likely speaking Aramaic, and that language distinction doesn't work in Aramaic. Like I said, it's really a matter of spelling. Petra for rock when you're talking about physical things, but if it's a name of a man, you gotta spell it with a masculine ending, and that's os, Petros, Petra. I don't think it's little pebble for Peter, but big rock for the church. I think that's a bit of a misguided conversation. Clearly, Peter's the leader of the 12. In this particular conversation, in the Greek, it's Jesus is using singular you. I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom. But 2 chapters later, in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus makes the similar remark about whatever you bind and whatever you loose. The you there is plural. So it's expanded to the 12.
Yeah, so obviously Doug is extremely intelligent. I don't think that he's wrong here, but I think that he's pointing at the wrong thing of this conversation, right? Nobody actually cares who the rock is. What we care about is what it means to be the rock. So the Catholics will say it is important that Peter is the rock because he is the foundation and the seed of the papacy. Because of that, he now has this position that nobody else has. Okay, that is why it's important for the Catholics. Where I think this conversation that Doug's kind of moving it into here is moving it into something else, right? Because for the Protestants, it's not the fact that Peter is this rock or this declaration is the rock, right? That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is putting Peter in a position that he does not belong in, right? Giving him this office that God never gave him, right? And changing the history of how things happened during the time of Jesus. Clearly, Peter is special in some ways, right? But so are all of the other apostles. So are all the followers of Jesus, right? We all have unique position, and we all are as close to God as anybody else, right? So having the office of something like the Pope, for example, it doesn't make sense within this confines for me. And again, I'm coming from this from a Protestant point of view, someone who doesn't listen to a lot of the traditions or a lot of the things that are going on, but I listen specifically sola scriptura to the scripture, right? And so for me, when I read this, when I read other sections of scripture, we do not see these offices and these positions being put into place as some official sort of thing that happens, right? And so while Doug is trying to keep the peace here and kind of trying to keep a middle ground here, the idea that Peter is not the rock and we should just avoid that, right? The idea that it's what is the rock that is the main situation. It's not that. The main situation is that Peter does not magically create this office of Pope that continues on after him, right? And so there's like this definite miscommunication here. That is the main issue between Protestants and Catholics, right? And so from my perspective, that's kind of what I see there for sure. Also, I would say that he makes the makes the talking point of it doesn't matter that it says Petros versus Petra, but it is important. Like he says specifically that Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic, so maybe he wouldn't have used those words anyways, right? Jesus possibly was speaking Aramaic here. He could have been. He also could have been speaking other languages because he spoke other languages, right? However, we see this written in Greek, and so those words are written in Greek in a specific way for a specific reason. So I think there is validation to that as well. God would not have delivered us this in this way if he didn't want us to understand it in that way. And so I think there's validity to that side of things as well. But anyway, no hate on Doug for sure. I just think that he's avoiding the main question as to not really heat up the table and make it something a little bit worse than it should be.
These are metaphors, and metaphors have this flexibility about them. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul uses a building metaphor to talk about the church, and all of the apostles are the foundation of the church, and Jesus is the cornerstone. Right. In Peter's first letter in the New Testament, he uses stone language to talk about Jesus as the stone. So those metaphors are mixed, and there's no technical terminology going on here. So I think in some ways this historic battle and tug and pull is beyond what the New Testament is actually saying in Matthew 16. It has more to do with church tradition and, is this really the papacy?
Yeah, there we go. Now he's getting to the core of the issue.
Evangelicals, Protestants, they got their questions about.
It's not that they have their questions about it. It's a hard no. It's so funny to see him want to keep the peace here, which is probably a smart thing, right? It's just funny to watch it.
Papal authority and how that's been used or abused in the past. And I think all that's beyond what's really going on here in Matthew 16. Is that fair?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And bind on earth and loosed in heaven and all.
I wonder why the priest isn't saying more. It's interesting.
Talk about that.
Maybe he just doesn't want to cause any issues either. I don't know.
Because I know that's a...
Well, I think Keys to the Kingdom talks about opening to all, but I think the leadership function is also internally within the community of believers. Mm-hmm. And in that phrase, there's a recognition that there needs to be an authority. There needs to be some authority that discerns God's will and discerns what is bound and what is loosed, and that in this, it establishes that authority with Peter as the leader, but leading the apostles in
I think so this is what I'm saying here. And again, please just be nice. This is what I'm saying here. When he's talking about this, he immediately jumps to this system that's put in place. There must be someone who discerns what needs to be bound and what needs to be loosed. There needs to be someone who needs to be put in place as a head of this thing, right? But Jesus never says that there's a thing that someone needs to be the head of, right? In Scripture, there is nothing that shows that. And so for me, it's just a jumping of logic. Like it's a leaping into something that isn't actually there for me.
Kind of deciding what it is that the community will hold people to, what it is that people will loose. And in some places too, this also leads to like sacramental idea of confession and the idea of forgiveness. So that could be part of it.
And is that where a lot of the priestly authority comes from? Is because the notion of a priest absolving of sin and whatnot is saying, again, evangelicals tend to be more comfortable with God does that. We don't need an intermediary.
Yeah.
And Catholics are saying, no, there's clearly a leadership being established here that has some of this authority that's granted by God.
Well, we would agree that God does it. So we would say that if there's forgiveness that happens, it's because of the work of God. Right. But there's also the idea that that faith is mediated, and it's mediated through Scripture, it's mediated through experience, and one of the ways that faith in reconciliation and forgiveness is mediated is through a minister of the church. Yeah, and ultimately the ministry of a priest or a bishop connects to the overall Petrine ministry. So we're kind of make a connection to that, although nowhere near that level. But
so he's saying we are acting as a piece of the papacy, but we are not the papacy. We are not Peter, but we are acting as a piece of Peter in order to forgive and do these different things and confession and different things like that. Interesting.
That would be in it, and reconciliation happens in a lot of ways in the Catholic faith. It's not that for everything that one does or says, you run right to confession, but it happens through prayer, it happens through one's relationship with Jesus Christ. But there is a time and a place where you just need to talk to people.
Right.
And that comes through in other episodes where Matthew goes to talk to Jesus and Peter goes to talk to Jesus. Would they have been able to do that by just sitting in prayer in their room?
Or would they have been able to do that with each other, right? And going to God, talking to each other, right? Yeah, I would question some of that stuff for sure, obviously.
Right. You know, they want to talk to somebody, and that's kind of the role, and the role in the office that's been passed down, that the Catholics believe has been passed down.
Yeah, and we have pastors, and you have rabbis, and you have. I mean, it's we all believe in leadership and in calling, and I mean, Paul has a lot to say about teachers and leaders and pastors.
Mm-hmm. I just, this is one of those things. So I understand the position that Dallas is in, right? I understand the position that he's in with the round table. He wants to keep the peace here. He wants to keep the peace within the chosen community, right? This is one of those things where it's like, there are a lot of things that I would completely just not put my foot down at all. There are just some things that I think are way too close to salvational issues that we have to have pretty strong conversations about. And so, yeah, these are some of the things that as a Protestant, as someone who is sola scriptura, right? Someone who finds their faith and drives their faith and everything that I do comes from scripture. These are some of the questions that I have, as I think there's a lot of leaps in logic that are being taken for certain things here. Yeah.
And that there is a specific calling and a specific authority granted. What's the Jewish interpretation of the bind on earth?
Yeah, there's something very interesting there. So if you go back and if we're assuming Jesus is speaking to them in Aramaic, and then you have what's known as the Talmud, which is the foundational writing for rabbinic Judaism that contains the basis or foundation of halakha, Jewish legal practice, and how you walk out the commandments of the Torah. It's actually a term used by the rabbis in Aramaic of binding and loosing, meaning something is permissible according to God and his commandments, and what is not permissible according to God and to his commandments. So it's a very technical term if you put it in a Jewish Aramaic legal context, right? And so you see that again playing out with Peter. Gentiles were unclean. It's the whole dream he has. It's not permissible to eat with Gentiles. It's not permissible to go into the house and to have that relationships with Gentiles. And so in a sense, he is loosening, right? To make it now permissible for this to be able to happen, which is part of the promise of the new covenant. So you see this kind of playing out from a legal perspective in the way traditional Judaism uses the terms.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I've never heard of that specifically before, but although thinking about it in those terms makes sense for sure. Yeah. I do, like he said earlier, we're assuming he spoke Aramaic here as well, and how he said this too. So we don't really know. Being in Caesarea Philippi, he definitely could be speaking Greek or even just Hebrew to his group of people so that the people around him didn't understand what he was saying too. So, yeah.
Again, you see it in the book of Acts chapter 15. What are the commandments that Gentiles need to keep? We see this being played out in the book of Galatians, and you have the believers having to bind and loose. What is permissible? What is not permissible? What do they have to keep? What do they not have to keep? And these are very real discussions that were going on among the first century believers, which is what the disciples were then given the authority and empowered by God, by the Spirit, to make that understanding, to bring forth that revelation and inspiration to make known. But I also think we can't underestimate the location of where this event happened.
Yep, 100%.
Okay, because you'd have people worshiping saying Caesar is Lord. You have people worshiping there saying Baal is Lord. People there worshiping saying Pan is Lord. Yep. And here we have the ultimate confession, Jesus, Yeshua is Lord. But that ties into another aspect.
Which is why we have Peter, or Simon at the time, right. He's saying all these idols, this death, Pan and Baal, that is not it. You are it.
You're it. And which is it's beautiful how you brought that out, because that is the essence. But not to get too mystical or to go off track, But what's also interesting is to understand that where they're at, where Banyas, which is where Caesarea Philippi is at the base of the highest point in Israel, which is Mount Hermon. So he takes them to the base of the highest point in Israel, and this is a high point.
This is a huge, huge, huge point. I wonder what he's exactly going to say here, but yeah, this is a massive point whenever I talk about this, what I talk about here as well. There's a reason why they're using the term of rock and these different things that are happening here in terms of the location as well.
In a sense, but according to the ancient book of Enoch, this is where the watchers come down out of heaven and decide they are going to have relationships with the daughters of men. Ties into what happens in the book of Genesis and the Nephilim and God having to bind these creatures. So there's a sense in which Jesus is going not just to the place of idolatry, but in a place in the minds of many first century Jews, a place of seat of demonic, spiritual rebellion and corruption.
Yeah, the beginning, the seed of that demonic corruption. Yeah.
And in a sense is beginning to take back the keys, beginning to take back the authority from the realm of darkness so that the kingdom can advance.
Yeah, in that line where Jesus is talking about Caesarea Philippi, what he says is basically, here at the gates of hell, right, we will overcome it. And the word that he uses there in the Greek, right, or that's written there in the Greek for the scripture, that word overcome, it's not, or the gates of hell will not prevail against it, right, is the phrase that's used there. And so that line there, will not prevail against it, is not this sense of like holding up a shield and being attacked and kind of cowering behind it, but it is of a battle, facing forward and offensively attacking the person that is coming at you. Okay. And so as Jesus is overtaking the gates of hell, overtaking this area of Mount Hermon, right, where all of these disgusting things are happening, including, we didn't really talk about it in this episode, but sleeping with goats. Okay. There's a lot of crazy stuff that's happening here. Jesus is talking about an offensive. He's taking back this area, and his church will prevail against the darkness that is here in this area, at this place. So it's a very specific thing that's happening here. Not just a flippant sort of, yay, we have the rock and we're gonna win now, right? It's a very, very important statement.
And thus they're at the gates of hell, that deep pit that's there in Caesarea Philippi. I would say there's maybe three other things about the Matthew 16 text to point out here. This binding and loosing, the Greek grammar, a very interesting construction. It says, whatever you bind or loose will have been bound, and it will have been loosed. Grammarians look at that construction and they say, so it's not that Peter is willy-nilly making these decisions, it's rather the decisions that he's making are actually reflecting decisions that God has already made in heaven. And he's the one enacting them, but they already were done. They will have been.
And he's the one discerning them and then enacting.
Yeah, and discerning. Yeah, good word. Mm-hmm. I think a second thing to point out, and you portray this in the show really well, Jesus says to Peter, yeah, this revelation you're declaring me as the Christ, the Son of God, is not of your own doing. This is a divine revelation. Again, it's God's decisions that are appearing to you. It's coming to your mind, not because you worked it up, but because God revealed it to you. So the decisions to bring the Gentiles in, that they're welcomed in, they're no longer bound away from God, they're loosed and free. Yeah, that's all something God has done. And I think it shows up in the grammar there.
Really, really cool stuff. We'll stop there for now. I appreciate you guys for being kind in the comments. We'll start with that. Thank you so much, guys, for checking this one out. Let me know your thoughts and just be kind. Don't start any arguments or else I'll have to delete all the comments. I don't want to do all that. So just be kind. Let's have some discussion and talk this through. I do find this very, very interesting from the different points of view. I don't think that this is a hugely salvational issue, so it's not something I'm willing to die on a hill about. However, I do think it's important for us to understand how God uses us, right? In Peter's case, I think God does use him in a special way. However, I don't think that there's this magical kind of office that appears out of nowhere with no explanation. I just don't think that that's the truth, at least for me. So those are my thoughts. Let me hear what you think in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys on the next one.